In the first week of March 1982, the soil in Sumner County, Kansas, smelled like something between iron and old fire. Roy Matteson knelt at the south edge of his wheat field at 4 in the morning, pressed 2 fingers into the ground, and felt nothing give. The surface sealed against his hand like compressed chalk. Hard dead. He was 63 years old. He had worked this ground since he was 8, when his father let him steer a horse-drawn disc down a furrow, and told him nothing afterward, which in that household was the same as praise. He could name winter wheat varieties by pressing the seed head between 2 fingers in the dark. He could stand at the north fence at first light and read the color gradient of a field and tell you what the subsoil had been doing for the past 6 weeks. He was a man who had spent 35 years listening to 320 acres in south-central Kansas, and what those acres were telling him in March of 1982 was that they were running out of time. He also owed $187,000 to the Federal Land Bank of Wichita at 16.5% interest. The note was his inheritance. His father, Leroy Matteson, had died in November 1979, a heart attack in the equipment shed on a Tuesday morning, and left Roy the land, the debt, and a locked metal box of papers under the workbench. Roy had refinanced at what a loan officer assured him was the current competitive rate. By March 1982, that rate had not moved the way the officer had implied it would. The monthly payment was $3,080. Roy had 11 months of operating reserves remaining. His wheat yields had averaged 26 bushels per acre for the previous 4 years. At the anticipated board price of $3.40 per bushel, 320 acres at 26 bushels returned roughly $28,200 gross, before the $9,600 he spent each year on seed and chemicals, before fuel, before the note. The math required no commentary. He had 2 growing seasons before the Federal Land Bank reviewed the loan status and exercised its options, and he knew what its options were because he had read the loan documents 3 times with a flashlight in the dark of the equipment shed, the way his father had probably read everything important, alone, after everyone else was asleep. The Sumner County Wheat Growers Association held its winter production meeting at the Extension Office on the 2nd floor of the Wellington Courthouse on the 2nd Tuesday in February 1982. Roy drove 31 miles in the dark to attend. He sat in the 3rd row. He watched a Kansas State University Extension agronomist named Dr. Gerald Faust deliver 90 minutes of slides about anhydrous ammonia timing, fungicide programs, and a new semi-dwarf variety called Carl 92 that was projected to yield 8 to 12% higher than sage on well-managed soil. The room held 42 farmers. Most of them were already using anhydrous. Most of them were nodding. Near the end, Roy raised his hand. He asked about soil organic matter. He asked, specifically, whether continuous anhydrous ammonia application at rates above 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre was affecting microbial activity at the 4 to 8 inch horizon, and whether that decline in biological activity might be affecting moisture retention in dry years. Dr. Faust was 41 years old. He had a brown corduroy jacket and the particular patience of a man who had practiced that patience for a long time. Soil microbiology is still a research frontier, he said. What the Extension Service recommends is based on replicated trial data, not on theoretical models. Organic soil amendments are interesting on a small scale, but they don't scale commercially, and they carry contamination risks. Particularly subsurface application, that's something we specifically advise against in Advisory Note 74B. He clicked to the next slide. Several farmers turned to look at Roy. He said nothing further. He drove home in the dark. What he had not mentioned at the meeting, what he had not mentioned to anyone in Sumner County, was the notebook. His father's metal box had contained, among the land abstracts and tax receipts, a composition notebook with a brown cardboard cover. 96 pages, dated in pencil on the front. 1944-1948. It was written in Leroy Matteson's spare, cramped hand with occasional diagrams in the margins, sketches of plow shanks, pit cross sections, a fermentation vessel improvised from a galvanized stock tank. In the back third of the notebook, in a section marked with a penciled asterisk, Leroy had written, "Kovalenko's method, exactly as he showed me." Vasyl Kovalenko had arrived in Sumner County in 1937. He was Ukrainian, a small man with enormous hands who farmed 80 acres outside of Milan, Kansas, and grew winter wheat that other farmers drove out of their way to look at. He spoke English adequately and never volunteered information about his methods unless asked, and sometimes not even then. In 1943, during a summer drought that cut county yields by 40%, Kovalenko's field produced 41 bushels per acre against a county average of 19. A Kansas state agronomist drove out from Manhattan to walk the ground and wrote a report that described the soil as unusually friable and moisture retentive, and attributed the yield to undetermined soil management practices. The agronomist offered to sample the field for study. Kovalenko declined politely. Leroy Matteson had been Kovalenko's neighbor and spent 3 autumns working alongside him. The notebook recorded the method precisely. A fermentation mixture of cattle manure, hardwood ash, and chopped winter wheat straw in proportions of 8 parts manure to 1 part ash to 2 parts straw by weight, submerged in water in a covered pit for 21 days at ambient temperature above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The liquid strained off and applied subsurface at 6-inch depth using injection shanks on a chisel plow at 40 gallons per acre. The solid residue broadcast at the surface at approximately 2 tons per acre, then lightly incorporated with a single disc pass. Timing: September, 4 to 6 weeks before winter wheat planting. The notebook noted, in Leroy's exact words, done in the same field continuously, at least 3 years before the full effect comes through in the structure. Leroy had tried the method on 40 acres in 1945 and recorded results each year through 1948. His notes showed a yield advantage of 6 to 9 bushels per acre over untreated ground in dry years, and little difference in wet ones. Then the notes stopped. Anhydrous ammonia became available commercially through co-ops in 1950. The county agent came around with yield projections that were persuasive. The old method required labor that synthetic nitrogen did not, and Leroy had put the notebook in the metal box and left it there for 32 years. Roy read the notebook 4 times in February 1982. On the 5th reading, he made a list. In the back of his equipment shed, under a canvas tarp that had not been lifted in 11 years, stood a 1958 Oliver 880 diesel tractor. Faded green and cream, attached to a 7-shank chisel plow, his father had modified in 1961 with 1/4-inch copper injection tubes running alongside each cutting shank. The tubes connected to a 60-gallon polyethylene tank mounted on a 3-point hitch frame, with a small gear pump driven off the tractor's PTO. His father had built the entire injection system to Kovalenko's specifications using hardware store copper tubing from Caldwell. He had greased everything before putting it away. The Oliver started on the 3rd attempt. The pump turned freely. The copper tubes were intact. Roy said nothing to anyone through March and April. In September 1982, he dug a pit at the edge of his south quarter, 10 feet long, 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and built the fermentation mixture according to the notebook, weighing each component on a hanging scale, bolted to a barn beam. 320 pounds of cattle manure from Duane Hatfield's feedlot 2 miles east, 4 part hardlight ash from the burn pile, 80 pounds of chopped straw from his own harvest. He covered the mix with water and sealed the top with corrugated tin weighted with fence posts. 21 days later, he strained the liquid through fine wire mesh into the polyethylene tank, calibrated the pump to deliver 40 gallons per acre at the Oliver's working speed, and ran the old tractor across 40 acres of his south quarter. The chisel shanks cut 6-inch furrows, and the copper tubes injected the amber liquid into the subsoil in parallel rows 30 inches apart. The smell coming off the worked ground was sharp and organic, not unpleasant, something like a forest floor after the first rain of autumn, something alive in a way the surface soil was not. He broadcast the solid residue behind the tractor and made a single disc pass. He seeded Carl 92 wheat 6 weeks later across all 320 acres, treating his north 280 acres in his standard program. Anhydrous at 90 pounds nitrogen, conventional tillage. Nobody asked what he had done in the south quarter. Nobody was close enough to see. At the Wellington elevator in December 1982, Ray Connors, who farmed 580 acres in the northeast of the county, mentioned that he had driven past Roy's south quarter after harvest and noticed the soil color was darker and the residue was lying differently. Roy said he had tried some different residue management. Connors bought Roy a cup of coffee and let it go. At Paulson's feed store on Main Street in Wellington in the early spring of 1983, Walt Kiefer, who had farmed all his life and considered himself an authority the county had never formally recognized, said loudly to no one in particular, and specifically to Roy Matteson, that he had heard Roy was injecting raw manure into his ground with a cattle rig, and that the county health office would have something to say about it. Roy looked at the bag of sunflower seed in his hand. He said, "It's fermented for 3 weeks. The pathogens are gone." Walt said he was sure that was what Roy believed. 3 other men in the store said nothing. Roy paid for the seed and walked out. The spring of 1983 was wet, and the yield difference between his 40 treated acres and the 280 untreated was narrow. 33 bushels per acre on the treated ground against 29 on the untreated. Real, but not dramatic. Roy recorded it in a pocket notebook he had begun keeping specifically for the method, and seeded another fermentation pit in September, scaling up to 80 acres. In May 1984, the rain stopped. April had delivered 1.3 inches. May produced 0.6. June produced 0.4. By the 3rd week of June, the county was in severe drought. Roy walked his south 80 acres at dawn on June 21st, pressing his fingers into the soil between the wheat rows at intervals. At 3 inches deep on the treated ground, the soil was damp, not wet damp, but present. On the north 240 acres, the soil turned to dry powder at 2 inches. On Dale Hockett's adjacent conventional ground, the wheat had begun to fire from the bottom, yellowing from moisture stress at the root line. Roy stayed crouched in the treated field for a long time, hand in the ground, the early Kansas light coming flat and warm off the south horizon. He did not celebrate. He wrote in the pocket notebook, South 80, moisture at 3 in, north field, dry at 2 in, difference noted. He closed the notebook and went back to work. The 1984 harvest on the treated 80 acres averaged 38 bushels per acre. The untreated 240 acres averaged 21. The county average that year was 19 bushels per acre. Roy sold 3,040 bushels from the treated ground at $380 per bushel. He sat at the kitchen table that night and recalculated the loan schedule. He was, by his own estimate, 2 years from clearing the note, if the treated ground held. He expanded the treatment to 160 acres in fall 1984. He built a second fermentation pit, larger, and ran the Oliver 880 for 3 days that September, the old diesel turning over at 1,100 RPM, the copper shanks injecting in rows across the expanding ground. At night he serviced the tractor, checked the oil, greased the chisel shank bearings, cleaned the pump screen, recorded the acreage completed in the notebook. The smell of the injected soil at night was earthier, deeper, something like the bottom of a well in August. It was a smell that meant the soil's biology was active at a depth where it had been absent for years. The near failure arrived in March 1985 in the form of a letter. The Federal Land Bank of Wichita had completed a routine portfolio appraisal and informed Roy that based on current commodity prices and drought-impacted county land values, his 320 acres had been reassessed at $287,000, down from the $412,000 valuation at the time of the original loan. The bank was exercising a provision requiring him to provide additional collateral or reduce the principal by $62,000 within 90 days, or face acceleration of the full balance. The letter was 2 pages and used the word acceleration 4 times. Roy sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. His wife, Norma, stood at the kitchen counter and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the letter had not already said. He put it on the table. He walked to the equipment shed and checked the Oliver's oil level and fuel filter and cleaned the copper injection tubes with a wire brush. Then he called an attorney in Wichita named Harold Stoll, who had handled farm loan restructurings and knew the Federal Land Bank's legal limitations under the Agricultural Credit Act of 1971. Harold Stoll told him the bank's appraisal methodology was contestable. A productive capacity appraisal, based on actual yield history per acre rather than comparable land sales, could produce a substantially different valuation. He would need 3 years of yield records from the treated ground. Roy read the pocket notebooks to Stoll over the phone, every number from 1982 through 1984. Stoll was quiet for a moment. He said, "Your treated ground is averaging what?" Roy told him again. Stoll said he would file for a third-party appraisal review under the FMHA appeal process within 10 days. The appeal took 7 months. The Federal Land Bank accepted a revised productive capacity valuation. The acceleration demand was withdrawn. Roy continued his monthly payments. In December 1985, he heard from Ray Connors that Dr. Gerald Faust had told the county production meeting that he had received inquiries about what Roy Matteson was doing on his south ground, and that farmers should not attempt to replicate it without consulting the Extension office first. Roy drove to the Extension office the following morning, asked to see Advisory Note 74B in writing, and read it at the counter. It was 2 pages. It cited 4 studies, all from the 1950s and 1960s, none of which addressed fermented amendment applications specifically. Roy photocopied it and mailed a copy to Harold Stoll with a handwritten note for the file. In September 1985, Roy treated all 320 acres for the first time. The process took 9 days. He ran 3 fermentation pits simultaneously and drove the Oliver 880 from before dawn until the light failed, each day. The tractor crabbing across the flat Kansas ground at 3 miles per hour, the copper shanks cutting their rows in sequence, the amber liquid disappearing into the earth without ceremony. Dale Hockett stopped at the fence line on the 3rd day and watched for a long time. Finally he said, "What is that you're running?" Roy said, "Modified chisel plow." Hockett said, "What's in the tank?" Roy said, "Fermented amendment." Hockett said, What kind?" Roy said, "Manure base." Hockett drove away. The summer of 1986 was the driest in Sumner County since 1956. By the 3rd week of June, the soil moisture deficit across the county had reached 5.4 inches below normal. A drought advisory covered the entire south-central Kansas region. Farmers with irrigation pivots began running them around the clock, spending money on water for ground that retained almost none of it. Roy had no irrigation equipment. He had 320 acres, an old Oliver tractor, and 3 years of fermented amendment worked into his subsoil at 6 inches. He walked the fields at dawn each morning that last week of June, pressing his fingers in at intervals. On the north half of his ground, the continuous treatment acres, moisture persisted at 4 inches. On the south half, treated only since fall 1985, the moisture held at 3 inches. On Hockett's adjacent field, the wheat had begun to fire from the base of the stems, the yellowing moving upward through the plant in the particular way that indicated root zone desiccation. Roy did not walk over to mention this. He walked back to the Oliver and checked the oil. The Sumner County Wheat Growers Association held its annual summer field day on the 2nd Saturday of July 1986 at the Draper operation on the east side of Wellington. The Extension Service organized it. Dr. Gerald Faust attended. A seed company representative from Kansas City drove down with display materials. Registered attendance reached 487. Roy Matteson was not on the program. He was not a host. He arrived at 9:15 in a pickup with 214,000 miles on the odometer and stood near the north gate in a tan canvas shirt and worn Wranglers and a cap with no logo on the front. What had happened in the weeks before the field day was this. Ray Connors had mentioned Roy's 1984 and 1985 yield figures to the County Association president, who mentioned them to farmers in Kingman and Harper counties, who told others. And by the morning of the field day, enough people had heard enough specific numbers about Roy Matteson's south ground that a group of 30 farmers arrived at the Draper field not to see the Draper operation, but to find Roy Matteson at the gate. When men walked up to him and asked how his ground was doing, he told them his numbers. Not a presentation. He said what the pocket notebook said, that his 320 acres had averaged 47.3 bushels per acre in the 1986 drought season against a county average, as reported by the elevator that morning, of 22.1 bushels per acre. He had the elevator receipt in his shirt pocket. He showed it to whoever asked to see it. By 11 o'clock, the group around him numbered between 80 and 90 people. By 1 o'clock, the main crowd had migrated from the Draper demonstration area to the north gate. Dr. Gerald Faust walked over at 1:30 and stood at the edge of the group and listened for 20 minutes while Roy answered questions. Roy did not look at Faust. He continued answering questions. A farmer from Harper County asked him to explain the injection process step by step, and Roy explained it. The proportions, the fermentation time, the application depth, the Oliver 880, the copper shanks his father had fabricated in 1961. He said it the way he read from the notebook. No emphasis, no advocacy. The sequence of steps in the order they occurred. When the crowd finally thinned near 2 o'clock, Faust walked up and stood in front of him. He said, "I'd like to come out and walk your ground." Roy said, "All right." Faust said, "I was wrong about the contamination risk. The fermentation process you're describing would address pathogen load." He said it simply, the way men say things when they have been working up to them. Roy nodded. He shook Faust's hand and walked back to his pickup. The 487 farmers at the Sumner County Field Day that July afternoon heard no speech. They saw an elevator receipt and a man who had nothing to sell them. By fall 1986, Roy had paid down $41,000 of principal ahead of schedule. Harold Stoll had filed a formal complaint with the Federal Land Bank's Regional Oversight Office in Omaha regarding the 1985 appraisal methodology. And in September 1986, the bank issued a corrective memo to its Kansas loan officers, stating that productive capacity appraisals must be weighted against a minimum of 3 years of actual yield data where such data exists. The memo did not mention Roy Matteson by name. It did not need to. The following spring, Faust walked Roy's 320 acres twice with a soil probe and temperature meter. He collected 14 samples from treated and untreated comparison zones and sent them to the KSU Soil Science Laboratory in Manhattan. The results showed that the treated ground contained 3.8 times the microbial activity at the 4 to 6 inch horizon compared to the untreated control, and retained 22% more available moisture at that depth under identical rainfall. Faust wrote the findings as a KSU agricultural research report. In the discussion section, he cited Kovalenko's name, which Roy had given him, and noted that the method represents a pre-chemical era soil management practice whose functional mechanisms are now verifiable by modern biological assay. Advisory Note 74B was formally withdrawn and replaced in March 1988. The new advisory, Note 88A, recommended fermented organic amendment application as a verified practice for improving subsoil moisture retention under drought conditions in the south-central Kansas grain belt. Roy received a copy in the mail. He read it at the kitchen table. He put it on the stack with the loan documents and the 1944 notebook and the Harold Stoll correspondence. Then he went out to service the Oliver. Dale Hockett converted 200 of his 480 acres to the fermented amendment system in fall 1987, using a chisel plow rig he built himself from Roy's specifications. His first drought season yield on the treated ground in 1988 averaged 39 bushels per acre against a county average of 24. He drove over to Roy's farm afterward and stood in the equipment shed for a while. He said, "I should have asked you sooner." Roy handed him a copy of the 1944 notebook and told him to copy it before returning it. Hockett copied it by hand over 2 evenings. In 1989, a KSU agronomist named Dr. Patricia Vance published a study in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation titled Subsurface Fermented Organic Amendment Effects on Microbial Biomass and Water Retention in Dryland Winter Wheat Systems. It cited the 1987 KSU research report and referenced the Sumner County case directly. The paper was read by Extension Services in Oklahoma, Texas, and Nebraska. The Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service incorporated the method into its drought year soil management recommendations in 1991. The method reached farmers in the Oklahoma Panhandle who had never heard of Sumner County and would not have known to call it anything other than what the Extension Circular called it: Subsurface Fermented Amendment Injection, or SFI. The name that did not appear anywhere in those circulars was Vasyl Kovalenko's. Roy understood why it didn't. He did not try to change it. He declined an invitation to speak at the Kansas Wheat Commission's annual conference in 1989 and again in 1990. He was 69 years old by then. He was not interested in speaking at conferences. He was interested in what the soil was doing under his south quarter. In the spring of 1997, Roy's granddaughter Claire drove down from Wichita on a Saturday morning and helped him service the Oliver 880. She was 22 years old, recently graduated in agronomy from Kansas State, which Roy found privately amusing and said nothing about. He showed her how to pack the chisel shank bearings, check the pump seals, flush the copper injection tubes with clean water, and inspect them for pinhole corrosion. She asked why he still used the old Oliver instead of the Case IH 7150 sitting in the barn. He said, "The Oliver runs the injection rig. The injection rig is built to the specifications in that notebook. If you change the rig, you have to retest everything." She asked why the specifications had to stay the same. He said, "Because they work. And because if something works and you stop doing it exactly, the reason it works goes with it." She wrote this down in a small composition notebook she had brought. Brown cardboard cover, the same kind as her great-grandfather's. Roy looked at it when she opened it, but said nothing about it. He walked her across all 320 acres that morning in the April light, stopping at intervals to press his fingers into the ground and name what he felt. He showed her the color difference between the continuous treatment ground and the unfertilized comparison strip he had maintained along the east fence line since 1982. He showed her how to read moisture at depth without a probe, the way the soil separated between the fingers, the temperature of it, the faint smell of biological activity at the 5-inch level that was absent from the comparison strip. Alive versus not alive, she could feel it. She asked, "Will it work in different soil types?" He said, "The biology is the same. The proportions may change. Start with what's in the notebook and observe." He handed her the 1944 notebook at the gate on the way back to the house. She carried it with both hands. Roy Matteson paid off the Federal Land Bank note in full in October 1993, 14 months ahead of the revised schedule. He received a release of lien by certified mail. He folded it once and put it with the other papers in the metal box. In the spring of 2001, on an April morning when the Kansas light came in flat and clear off the south horizon, Roy walked his south quarter one last time before his second hip surgery made long walks inadvisable. He moved slowly, the way a man moves when he has learned not to rush the ground. He knelt at the same spot where 19 years earlier he had pressed his fingers into sealed soil at 4 in the morning with $187,000 of debt and 2 seasons of options and the smell of iron and old fire in the air. He pressed his fingers in. The soil gave under them, dark, yielding, smelling of something alive. Moisture at 4.5 inches at the end of a dry April. The wheat in the row above his hand, standing straight and green. He stayed crouched there for a moment, his right hand in the earth, the flat Kansas light moving over the field in long, low waves. Then he straightened and walked back toward the equipment shed where the Oliver 880 stood cold and waiting, green and cream in the dim light, copper tubes coiled on their brackets, the old machine maintained correctly and therefore still entirely itself. What the soil remembered, the soil kept. What the man knew, the man passed down, not in speeches, not in the papers that eventually came, but in a brown cardboard notebook and a set of copper tubes and a granddaughter who wrote things down because she had been shown, in a wheat field in April, what it cost when knowledge was put in a box and left there. The ground in Sumner County did not need anyone's approval to retain moisture. It needed to be fed at the right depth, with the right material, in the right season, without interruption. That was the whole of it. The soil is still there.